Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to another Jane Eyre adaptation comparison video, especially those of you who have been waiting nearly 3 months for this. I meant to get to this one much sooner, but to be honest, I think I've been putting it off because it's kinda yucky. I also wasn't sure how I wanted to tackle this scene, whether I wanted to discuss it from the omniscient perspective of someone who knows the whole story, or just talk about the scene as it is. I've decided to go that route, just talk about the scene itself and not go into spoilers. That makes it easier for me, and easier for everyone else watching, hopefully. I've also decided to split this part of the story, chapter 20, into 2 halves. This video will cover only the attack on Mason itself, and I'll do a separate one on the Jane and Rochester conversation that immediately follows it. As for the yuckiness, well, I really can't do anything about that, but I won't show you any gross screenshots, and I think we'll be okay. The material we're comparing today can be found in the first half of chapter 20 of Charlotte Bronte's novel. When we left off last time, Richard Mason from Jamaica had just arrived at Thornfield. Late that night, Jane wakes to a bright moon shining in her window. Suddenly she hears a man screaming and the sounds of struggle above her room. She rushes out to the hall where the alarmed guests are gathering. Rochester appears and assures them it was only a servant having a nightmare and urges them back to bed. But Jane knows better. She returns to her room and gets dressed, expecting Rochester to come to her door and ask for help. And sure enough, he does. After first making sure that she doesn't turn sick at the sight of blood, Rochester brings her up to the forbidden 3rd story. They enter a room where a door that is usually kept closed and locked has been left open. Jane hears strange, animalistic noises coming from beyond it, but Rochester quickly goes and closes the door. Jane then discovers that Mason is in the room, lying in a chair covered in blood. Rochester tells her to press the wound and sit with Mason while he goes to get a doctor, and leaves them under strict orders not to talk. For nearly 2 anxious hours, Jane sits and ponders. She occasionally hears disturbing sounds in the other room and wonders who or what is on the other side of that door. Finally, Rochester returns with the doctor, who examines Mason and remarks that the skin is not just cut, but torn. There are teeth marks, and Mason, quaking with fear, gasps that, quote, "She worried me like a tigress." Rochester tries to calm Mason and keep him from saying too much, while also hustling the doctor to get him ready to go as quickly as possible. After sending Jane for some fresh clothes and Mason's cloak, Rochester and the doctor haul Mason down to a waiting carriage. Before he goes, Mason makes a plea to Rochester, saying, quote, "Let her be taken care of, let her be treated tenderly," and Rochester replies that he does his best, that he has done it, and will do it. This is arguably the most disturbing scene in this moody Gothic novel. The situation is one straight out of a classic horror story, with the screams in the middle of the night and the strange visitor covered in blood. And while Jane's narrative never becomes overdramatic and loses touch with reality, the incident is charged with heavy atmosphere. Jane's observations of what she hears in the other room are alarming, to put it mildly. And then, of course, there are the doctor's and Mason's comments about his wound, which brings to mind ideas of vampirism. These descriptions, coming at a point when we know next to nothing about who's behind all this, suggest something monstrous, possibly even supernatural. Jane really expresses this best herself. What crime was this that lived incarnate in this sequestered mansion and could neither be expelled nor subdued by the owner? What mystery that broke out, now in fire and now in blood, at the deadest hours of night? What creature was it that, masked in an ordinary woman's face and shape, uttered the voice now of a mocking demon and anon of a carrion-seeking bird of prey? Fortunately for us, this scene, unlike some more dialogue-heavy scenes, lends itself nicely to the screen. It also allows for more stylistic variation in interpretation, which certain adaptations definitely take advantage of. I'd also like to say that I admire Jane a lot in this scene. She exhibits a tremendous amount of foresight and composure. She figures some things up and expects she'll be called on for help, so she has the good sense to go back to her room and get fully dressed so that she'll be ready when Rochester comes knocking on her door. Only 2 adaptations, 1973 and 2006, have her do this. I also appreciate her mettle. She's just a young, inexperienced governess. She's not a nurse. And this is a crazy, weird situation. She doesn't know if she's gonna feel faint at the sight of blood or not, but she's determined not to fall apart or back out. I'd like to think that I could handle the situation the way that Jane does, but she's made of stronger stuff than me in this scene. This is how things would probably turn out if I were in her shoes. Jane, you don't turn sick at the sight of blood, do you? Blood? You didn't say anything about blood. Well, can you handle this or not? I mean, I can try. This is an emergency, after all. Okay, we're going in. Oh, wow, that's a lot of blood. Okay, I'll be with you in a second. Oh, wow, that's so much blood. Ugh. Okay, I'm good. Nope, I'm not good. Nope, sorry, you gotta get somebody else. Yeah. Okay, on to the adaptation comparison. We'll skip 1934 because it doesn't have this scene, so we'll move right along to the 1944 version. Being the only version in black and white, this one has a big advantage over the others in my opinion. This adaptation already has great black and white cinematography throughout, but it's the spooky, atmospheric stuff like this where the photography really shines. There's a great use of lighting and set pieces here, and I love the Gothic castle look. There are some additions to the scene. One, to stoke the flames of jealousy, is that Jane witnesses a little gallantry between Rochester and Blanche, which is unusual compared to his behavior toward Blanche in most other versions of this scene, where he's dismissive, terse, even belittling. Rochester also jokes that the supposed servant's nightmare was caused by eating toasted cheese for supper. But the addition that always sticks in my memory is the moment when Jane is left alone with Mason and the locked door starts to rattle. I found this so ominous when I was a kid. At this point, we don't know what's on the other side trying to come through, so this is a terrifying moment, for Jane and for us. With no glaring omissions and very little that I object to, this is a close approximation of the scene in the book. It has an appropriate emphasis on the mystery and the frightening elements, which are greatly enhanced by the photography. I found this interpretation of the scene so effective as a child that it's always stayed with me, so that when I picture this part of the book, it looks a little like this. The 1970 version kicks the scene off with a particularly awful scream, and then for a surprise, it throws Mrs. Fairfax into the mix. She's not usually included in this scene, but here we see her rushing to Rochester's room and finding it empty. A moment later, after Rochester has appeared and is dismissing his guests, he comes over to ask Jane to get a sponge, and while her back is turned, he conspiratorially shakes his head at Mrs. Fairfax. Interesting. Aside from the addition of Mrs. Fairfax, the biggest changes here are that Jane spots a knife lying on the floor near Mason, and she kind of overreacts to it, and Rochester does not go to get the doctor, instead driving him there himself. Jane is left alone with Mason not for a couple hours, but for a couple minutes, while Rochester swaps that amazing dressing gown of his for regular clothes, so the wait time is not nearly as bad for Jane. Rochester then carries Mason down to the carriage like a baby and drives off, leaving Jane to wait around for his return. That's a little odd, but the script needs her to stick around for the second part of the scene. They could have just left it the way it is in the book, but okay, I guess this works too. The 1973 version, what a surprise, follows the book to the letter, up to a point. It's the only version where Jane is awakened by the bright moon before the screaming starts, and it's one of two versions where Jane has the presence of mind to get dressed and be ready for Rochester's summons. It is also the only version to have the piece of furniture with the 12 apostles on it, which Jane mentions in the book, and it is the only one to close the scene with Rochester saying, "Would to God there was an end of all this." Rochester's behavior here is a little backwards compared to how it is in some other adaptations. He does lose his temper with his guests, the clingy ladies in their floofy diaphanous nightgowns and dressing gowns especially, but he does not lose it with Mason. That is as I think it should be. The adaptations are pretty evenly divided on this point. In some of them he's downright furious with Mason, while in others he's annoyed or chagrined, but not without sympathy. He's definitely irritated here, and keeping his answers short to keep Mason from blabbing away, but he's also understanding of what Mason tried to do and how awful the consequence is. There is one other very significant thing that I need to address before I move on, and that is Jason's pronunciation of the term volatile salts.
And salts. Volatile salts.
Volatile? Is that how you're supposed to say it? Volatile salts?
Volatile salts.
Have I been saying it wrong this whole time, or is that just him being fancy? Now, 1973 and 1983 have this ongoing competition in my mind over who's going to be more faithful to the book. In this instance, 1973 is perhaps more faithful to the first half of the scene, while 1983 is more faithful to the second half. There are some additions that 1983 makes, like Jane overhearing Rochester advising Mason not to go up there now, but then reluctantly opening the door for him. Also, when Jane and Rochester get to the room, he makes her wait while he unlocks the inner door and tells Grace Poole to keep her quiet. When Jane hears Grace's voice, it wakes her old fixation with Grace, something that we'll see repeated in the 1997 adaptation. I'm surprised Rochester does not take Jane's hand here to make sure it's not cold or shaky. That's a great excuse to hold her hand, you know, Rochester. I'm surprised you passed that up. It's in the book, and nearly everyone else does it, although only 44 and 73 have him comment that her hand is, quote, warm and steady. Unlike my hands, which would somehow manage to be both freezing and clammy, and probably shaky. Rochester tells Mason that if he speaks to Jane in his absence, it will be on peril of his life, which is pretty threatening, and he is testy with him to the point that he sharply rebukes him, but then he backs off, saying that Mason's suffered enough. Far from being violent and accusatory, he actually tries different tacks to encourage Mason and buck him up, until finally he resorts to a more direct method, the administration of some strong red stuff, probably alcoholic. All of this, as well as Rochester sending Jane to get some clean clothes and Mason's cloak, is in the book, and this is the only version to include it. If you remember where we left off in the 1996 version, we actually had an additional scene where Mason watches Grace Poole stumble down the hall with a bottle in her hand. After that, we cut to a shot of Jane dozing in a chair, fully dressed. She's awakened by a cry and immediately rushes to Adele's room to check on her. Rochester then appears, rushing to Jane's room looking for her help. We see nothing of the guests. Rochester is impatient with Mason, but in a chill way. The way that hurts Rochester is pretty low-key about everything. Here's a different line.
It is not her fault. I know that's not my fault either. If anyone's to blame, it's you.
Nobody says anything about teeth marks, and there are no scary noises coming from behind the door, so this really feels like it's just the bare bones of the scene. The more horrific aspects are understated or left out entirely, perhaps because this is a more romanticized adaptation. With 1997, I have a lot of the same things to say about the interpretation of this scene that I've said about others. The lines from the book are there, but they've all been altered slightly, which I find kind of pointless. This Jane's fixation with Grace Poole resurfaces in a big way, and it just seems like an annoying red herring, and her nosy questions about Mason prompt a snappish response from Rochester, who's impatient and rough throughout this whole sequence. Okay, hold on, there's gotta be something I like here. I think it does a good job emphasizing the sounds of struggle above Jane's room, and we can definitely make out a man and a woman, something that isn't always apparent, although in the book she only hears Mason's cries, so... Jane does get dressed, but only after Rochester comes and tells her to. He gets impatient waiting and tells her to hurry up. The guests don't rush out of their rooms, which leads you to believe that they didn't hear anything, except then Blanche pops out to ask what all the screaming was about, so they did hear things, they just didn't care, apparently. This is the only version where the word vampire is used, by Mason. Also, this is the only time that Jane acts in place of the doctor, examining the wound as if she knows about this kind of thing. It also adds a soppy voiceover where Jane mentally pledges her loyalty to Rochester and thinks how much more akin to him she is than Blanche. Now's not the time, Jane! Once again, Jane is only alone with Mason for a few minutes, but in that amount of time, Grace Poole enters the room through the locked door, approaching Mason to inspect his injury and unaware that Jane is hiding behind the door. When Rochester comes back and Jane exclaims, "I saw her! She came in the room!" he probably suffers a minor heart attack. She then goes on about how unsafe the house is with Grace in it, but Rochester cuts her off and manhandles Mason down to the carriage in a way that probably makes his injury even worse. You know, I've watched this version plenty of times over the years and always felt relatively content with it, but it really doesn't come out looking too good in these adaptation comparisons. The 2006 version prefaces this scene with a nightmare sequence. Jane wanders the hall, passing Grace Poole and encountering a little girl who screams. That scream coincides with the real scream in the night, and Jane wakes. Like in 44 and 70, Rochester jokes with his guests. Instead of telling them a servant had a nightmare, he says that they're dabbling in the occult, and eating too many crabs for dinner is making them hear things. The huge addition here is that Rochester's hand, which he keeps tucked behind his back, has been wounded and is dripping blood onto the floor. Jane is the only one to notice this and comes to stand close beside him to mask it. Blanche bristles at this, of course. When Rochester and the guests move down the hall, Jane quickly mops it up. Immediately after, our wise and resourceful Jane quickly dresses, so she's ready to go when Rochester comes for her. Something else they add on the long journey up the tower is that Rochester pauses to ask Jane if she wants to go back. That's considerate of him, though not canonical. Rochester is also much kinder and gentler with Mason here, though he does still whisper a warning not to speak. This version comes close to the 1944 level of creepiness for me. There's a lot of build-up to the reveal of Mason, the door rattles violently, the candle blows out, and as the scene crescendos, Jane promises Mason that she will not let him die. And lastly, 2011. In this version, as Jane joins the guests in the hall, Rochester murmurs for her to wait for him before he addresses the crowd. Perhaps Blanche notices this because she asks him if there's anything she can do. When she gets rejected, she casts a dirty look at Jane, and so does her mother. Weirdly, they don't have to travel very far to get to Mason. He's in a locked room just a little further down the hall. This wound is especially juicy. I think the makeup job and the sound effects have gotten more detailed with each adaptation. Great. Jane hears noises in the other room, but what's really accentuated here is the sound of the wind howling. In a prolonged horror movie-like sequence, the tapestry moves, and Jane slowly approaches it and listens for something on the other side. Rochester comes back pretty fast and seems to wonder if she was checking out the door. His interactions with Mason are reduced from what they are in the book, and he doesn't hurry the doctor as much as some other Rochesters do, especially Dalton in 83, but he still seems determined to get Mason out of there as soon as possible. This and 1970 are the only two versions where Mason doesn't get to make his parting plea. Here, it feels like Rochester knows what he wants to say and doesn't want to hear it, walking away as Mason calls his name. Okay, so that's the attack on Mason. That wasn't so bad, was it? We survived. Do I have a favorite here? I don't know. There are things about the 1944 version that I really like, that really gives that one some extra oomph. But most of the other versions have something that they bring to the table, so there's something about everything. Next time we'll do the rest of Chapter 20, the conversation between Jane and Rochester that immediately follows this scene, and I promise you will not have to wait as long for that as you did for this. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your own thoughts on the different interpretations of this scene in the comments down below. I love to hear what you all have to say, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.